Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this afternoon's webinar on the transition strategy for ISO 27001-2022. I'm Alan Calder. I'm the founder of IT Governance. I've been involved in the business of cybersecurity and privacy for some 25 odd years and led the first implementation of a management system to what was then a British standard, and which has become ISO 27001 and been through a number of iterations ever since. I've written a number of books. I've written one in particular on how to implement ISO 27001 and the ways in which it can be an effective management system for organizations looking to deal with today's increasingly complex and sophisticated cyber threats. And that book coming up now for its 8th edition, focusing on the 2022 version of the standard, is due to become available in June. I believe you can pre-order it right now. So IT Governance has been around for about 20 years. We've got some pushing up for 200 people inside the business. Our core focus is around ISO 27001, so we have lots of experience in helping organizations implement ISO 27001, and we've been through a couple of transitions from 2008 and from 2013 versions, and now from 2013 to 2022 version of the standard. So we kind of understand some of the complexities and challenges around transition, the ways in which organizations can go about doing that. And we've built up a very comprehensive range of products and services to help organizations, not just with ISO 27001, but across the broad range of cybersecurity and privacy. You'll have noticed that you're all on mute. That's deliberately so that we can try and make sure there are no background noises or other disturbances for people. But as we go through the webinar, if you find you have questions, please do pose them in the webinar control panel that you will have used to log in. There's a chat function. Use either that or the Q&A function and type your question in there. When we come to the end of the webinar, it's going to be about 35 minutes or so of me talking through a prepared script. Then I'll deal with whatever questions you've got. We'll share the question with the audience, and then I'll provide you with the answer. So do feel free to ask whatever questions you think are useful or where you think I can help you tackle that. Apologies in advance for the fact that every now and then I have to sniff or deal with the lurgies in my system. One of the many benefits of remote working and doing presentations through the web is that there is no danger of sharing viruses and so on with audiences, so that's quite good news. But it does mean that every now and then you'll see me sticking a handkerchief up my nose, for which apologies in advance. So that's the background. We are experts in this. We've, as said, done some 1,600 cybersecurity projects. We've helped some 1,300 organizations prepare and maintain their ISO 27001 compliance. So now something like 60,000 organizations around the world that have ISO 27001 certification. We've helped 5,500 organizations become Cyber Essentials certified. We're a CE certification body. We've got some greater than 1,100 organizations using our governance, risk and compliance software. So a very comprehensive product and service suite supporting organizations thinking about how to tackle what you're doing. And a number of you will be existing customers, so you'll be aware of our focus on supporting customers in their journey to cybersecurity. Today we're going to talk about the changes introduced by ISO 27001-2022, how that affects organizations implementing the standard for the first time, what it means for organizations that are already certified and how they might transition from the 2013 version of the standard, the core of what an effective transition strategy would look like, and some of the practical advice and solutions that might be appropriate for organizations and individuals tackling the transition. So that's the agenda. As I said, about 35 minutes of me talking, and then any questions you've got, please, through the chat function or the Q&A function in your screen. So, changes introduced by the standard. Background to the change: the last version, the new version of the standard was published October the 25th last year. The last revision to the standard was back in 2013, so that's almost a decade ago. And the expectation around 27001 2022 has been significant because, of course, the world of cybersecurity has changed quite a lot. And people were looking to the revised standard to reflect the changes in the way organizations might address cybersecurity. The reality is that the way you manage cybersecurity hasn't changed very much in the last 10 years. It's the controls and the nature of the threat for which the controls are appropriate that's changed. So not surprisingly, from that perspective, there's not been a lot of change in the standard itself. The change is much more in the set of controls. And I'm going to come to those and talk about those in a bit more detail. But before I do that, it's worthwhile just having an idea about what the transition process looks like, because many people think a new standard arrives, therefore automatically it replaces the old standard. You've got to make an instant transition, or if you were implementing to one, you've now instantly got to do to the next. But that is not the case. It takes about 6 months for accreditation bodies. Accreditation bodies are the organizations around the world who accredit certification bodies. And accreditation bodies prepare a certification scheme. It sets out how certification bodies go about auditing compliance with the standard, sets out requirements of certification bodies. So in the UK, the accreditation body is UCAS, the United Kingdom Accreditation Service, and it accredits certification bodies like, particular order, LRQA, BBQI, BSI, British Assessments Bureau, and others. So about 6 months for accreditation bodies to put together a certification scheme, and that accreditation body exercise has to be coordinated around the world, because the point about going down a UCAS accredited certification scheme is that your certification will be recognized around the world. So accreditation bodies coordinate what they're doing. They work to an IAF framework, International Accreditation Federation. They work to a framework which is agreed amongst all of them, which sets out how certification will happen. So typically about 6 months before, certification bodies have a scheme under which they can qualify to audit to a new standard. There's typically then a transition period for organizations that complied with an old version of the standard, which is usually around 18 months, for them to plan and carry out a transition so that their transition audit can take place typically in line with renewal of their management system certification or an interim audit or such things. So you don't have to have a disruptive process of transitioning your certification. So typically, you can't expect to get certification to new standard until around about 6 months after it's published. So in some cases, accreditation bodies and certification bodies were ready to go more quickly, but broadly speaking, most certification bodies were not in a position to certify compliance until sort of March, April of this year, the transition period from after publication in October last year. There's then a mandatory period. You've got a transition period. At the end of the transition period, typically it's the point at which the old standard is retired and certification bodies will no longer certify to the old standard. You can continue with an old standard. You can go on being certified. You can have a certification ISO 27001 2013, which expires, and you don't renew it. You can't renew once the transition period is finished. You can't renew to the old version of the standard. You can renew to the old version of the standard in the transition period and then make a transition later on. But you've got to accept that if you choose not to update, not to upgrade your certification to a new version of the standard, your certification will simply lapse. By the time the deadline for transition happens, you've got to have planned for and carried out and made your transition. Bear in mind that lots of organizations tend to leave this to the last minute, so there's a big crowd in the last 3 months of the period before everything closes, as everybody rushes to try and get themselves certified. So it's a good idea, because there are only so many certification auditors in the world, it's a good idea to try and get it done early on rather than later on. In reality, there's always a transition. There's always a period in the transitionary phase where you could certify to an old version of the standard, and you can certify to a new version of the standard because the one has gone live, it's available for certification. The other one is still live and hasn't been closed up. So that's a technical possibility. Most organizations tend, though, to look for certification to a new version of the standard as soon as it is practically possible. So that's the general situation. In specifics, looking at ISO 27001:2022, the requirements are that the accreditation body has to be ready to assess certification bodies to ISO 27001:2022 no later than 6 months from the last day of publication of the standard. So that's last day of publication would be the 31st of October. So 6 months later, the end of April, all accreditation bodies have to have been ready to audit their CBs to the new standard. It has to be available, therefore, to certification bodies by no later than 6 months from the last day of publication. So from the beginning of May, it's a requirement that it is possible for an organization to seek certification to the new version of the standard. And all transitions of CABs, that's of certification bodies, must be completed by 12 months from the last day of publication. So all certification bodies must be in a position to certify to 27001:2022 by the end of October 2023. For the certification body, initial certification by the certification body of us, the clients, to 27001:2022 must begin no later than 12 months from the last day, from, in other words, the end of October 2022, and all certified clients must transition by 36 months later. So there's a 3-year transition period. So by the end of October 2025, all organizations that want to continue to be certified to ISO 27001 must have transitioned to the new standard. So that's the fixed in the ground, that's the transition timetable, that's the table that you're working with. And this will apply to all accreditation bodies around the world, all certification bodies around the world. You can rely on this being the case. And if you have a CB who's not managing to work within what's really quite a straightforward set of timetables, then I'd suggest changing your certification body. There are a number of certification bodies who got their act together and were ready to go virtually as soon as their accreditation body was able to assess and certify them. So that's the formal change timetable. Let's look now at changes to the standard. And I'm going to look at this in two steps. The first is the standard itself. So that's clauses 4 through 10 of ISO 27001. This is what a management system looks like. This is what you must do in order to have a management system that conforms to ISO 27001. And then there is Annex A, which lists a set of controls. And Annex A lists controls which are all set out in ISO 27002:2022. So the new version of ISO 27002 was published before 27001 in time terms, and it's a much more detailed set of changes than changes to the standard. So let's look first at clauses 4 through 10. And here the changes are relatively straightforward. They're not complicated. You could virtually get this knocked out in the course of half a day at the most. It's a straightforward set of changes. Obviously, you'll need to get a copy of the standard, as with all certifications. You need to know what it is you're complying with. But context and scope, so clause 4, the requirement is to identify the relevant requirements of interested parties. It was to simply identify the requirements of interested parties, which is kind of imprecise. It suggests that you might identify health and safety requirements, for instance, because a customer of yours has health and safety as a requirement. But health and safety is not relevant to ISO 27001, so all this is saying is focus on the requirements of interested parties that are relevant to information security management. The other specific change in clause 4 is that the scope now includes the processes needed, and that's to manage information security, and their interactions between processes, and that includes processes internal and external. Clause 6 is about planning. So You always were required to set out information security objectives. It wasn't an explicit requirement that they should be documented. That is now a requirement. Your information security objectives must be monitored and made available, quote, as documented information. So that's a very clear statement. Most organizations will put those into their information security policy, the objective or objectives for which the information security management system is being put in place. Probably in your information security policy, very clearly documented. If you need more information, that might be a supporting document to the policy. Perhaps the most significant change in Clause 6 is a requirement that when you're making changes to the management system, you plan the changes to the management system. You don't just kind of do that, you need to plan it. And that, of course, is going to be important when you make the transition, because transitioning to 27001/2022 is a change to the management system. So this would be a good point at which to demonstrate that you've understood the requirements of the clause and you plan your transition and you execute the plan as you put it together. Clause 7 looks at support. The requirements are to define who will communicate and the processes for effecting communication. That requirement's been replaced simply by a broader requirement to define how to communicate. I think the original set of requirements was fine. Making the transition to simply recognize that you've got to define how to communicate. For me, that means you're going to define who will communicate and the processes for effecting communication. So in practical terms, I don't think there's very much to change here. You might want to change the words to bring them into compliance in your own documentation, to bring them into compliance. But in terms of practical implementation, I don't think there's a blind bit of difference here. Clause 8, operations, establish criteria for processes to implement the actions identified in Clause 6. So in planning, this is your clearly information security objectives, as well as plan changes to the ISMS. What are the criteria that you're going to put in place to determine what processes and what actions are appropriate to implement the decisions that are reflected in your planning documentation? Extension to the context of identifying in Clause 4 processes needed and their interactions is the requirement in Clause 8 to specifically control externally provided processes, products, or services that are relevant to the ISMS. This is a more specific requirement than what we had. That was simply originally externally provided processes or external processes you're required to control. Now it's specifically processes, products, or services relevant to the ISMS. And this really does reflect very much the outsourcing of services, the extent to which organizations buy in services, either limited services or much more extensive desktop monitoring and so on services. So being really clear about how you control them, not just what they are, but how you deal with the information security risks in those processes. And then finally, clauses 9 and 10, which deal with performance and evaluation. The methods of monitoring, measuring, analyzing, and evaluating the effectiveness of the ISMS must reflect changes in the needs and expectations of interested parties. And that means you need to be able to track changes in the needs and interests, and the needs and expectations of interested parties. That was always an assumption of management review, is that you would look at changes in expectations and requirements, and that's now just simply documented. So as you see, not a lot in the way of substantial changes to the management system itself. Not so when we come to Annex A. Now, remember, Annex A is a referent control set. It's not, you're not required to implement Annex A at all. All you're required to do is implement controls that are appropriate to deal with the risks that you've identified and to map those controls to the controls in Annex A, because Annex A provides a common point of reference for all organizations in terms of looking at their controls. The reality is that most organizations will tend to implement the controls that are in Annex A, they're in ISO 27002, because they are well thought through, well structured, well documented, and there's a lot of understanding about how those controls work. So it's worthwhile having a bit of an understanding of the changes in ISO 27002 because of how they're reflected in Annex A. There are now 93 controls. There were 114 in the 2013 version of the standard, so you've got 21 fewer controls. And those controls, which used to be grouped into 14 separate clauses, are now grouped into 4 themes. And the themes are organizational, technological, physical, and people. So as in on the bottom left of the screen as you look at it, there are 37 specific controls relating to organizational information security, 34 relating to technological aspects, 14 relating to physical security, and 8 relating to controls around people-specific related risks. Amongst those 93 controls, so a number of controls have gone, but there are a number of very new controls which have been added, and those are around threat intelligence, the use of threat intelligence to inform and update your risk assessment, the information security for the use of cloud services, not surprising considering the substantial number of organizations who migrated to the cloud, particularly during the onset of the pandemic, ICT readiness for business continuity, that's a development of an existing control. Physical security monitoring is an advance on the requirements around physical security, configuration management, information deletion, particularly with reference to most privacy legislation like GDPR, data masking and data leakage prevention, monitoring activities, web filtering, and secure coding. So these are areas where many organizations already have some form of control in place, but have struggled to find a reference point in Annex A. Annex A now lists them, and if you're implementing ISO 27002 controls, then your mapping is quite straightforward, of course, but you've got all of the guidance in 27002 on how to implement. What are the key issues in implementing those controls? Not only are those controls in 27002 grouped into 4 themes, they also, every control now has 5 types of attributes. 5 types of attributes. So for every control, and you see this when you look at ISO 27002, it will tell you what the control type is. Is it a preventive, detective, or corrective control? In other words, is it designed to prevent an information security risk materializing? Is it designed to detect it in time for something else to be done to stop it? Or is it designed to correct it after it has occurred? Which information security properties specifically does the control deal with? Is it confidentiality or integrity or availability or some combination of those 3? Which concepts, which cybersecurity concepts are reflected in the control? Is it an identify, protect, detect, respond, or recover concept? This is looking at the cybersecurity life cycle. Is it, which operational capabilities does it deal with? Is it a governance control? Is it about asset management, etc.? And which security domains, governance and ecosystem protection, defense, resilience, does the control apply to? And these attributes are designed to make it easy for organizations to select the controls appropriate to not only their risk, but you should be dealing with risk in the context of the interests and requirements of interested parties. So the clause 4.1 requirements of interested parties, which includes regulatory bodies, it includes customers, it includes law enforcement, and it should be possible for you to go, okay, I've got all of those requirements clearly identified in clause 4.1 documentation. These are how those controls talk to those requirements when you build your baseline security control framework. You don't need a risk assessment necessarily to, as many people who will have been on our courses or worked with us know, you don't need to do a risk assessment to determine what control to put in place where there is a legal or contractual requirement to put it in place. You simply don't. You just need to recognize that's the legal or contractual, whatever is requirement, this control is in place to deal with that. Your risk assessment might determine how much you spend on the control. It might determine what other controls you put in place, but that's what ISO 27002 is designed to do. Now, the Joint Committee putting together 27002 made it really easy for organizations, for 27001 rather, made it really easy for organizations to handle the transition because they've included a table in ISO 27001 2022, which says very clearly this is how the controls relate. So you don't need to work it out for yourself. You can simply go and have a look at table B2, and it says that in 27002-2013, control 5.1, well, it doesn't appear. Management Direction for Information Security is not in 2022, but 5.1.1 is now renumbered as 5.1, and that's policies for information security. There's a detailed read across, a detailed identification of what are the 2022 controls that link to, and how do they link to the controls in 2013. So that's designed to make life easy for you. The other area that the standards body has tackled is ISO 27005. I'm going to talk very briefly about 27005, not because that's officially part of the course, but because ISO 27005 is a standard which is designed to provide guidance on the implementation of the information security risk requirements in ISO 27001. So the risk assessment standard has been aligned with ISO 27001-2022. It's designed to be used by and is written in the same terms and the same language and with the same specific references as you are finding in 27001 and 27002-2022. But remember, 27005 is not mandated as the approach to risk assessment. Many organizations nevertheless treat it as the logical way to go because it's a well-developed risk assessment standard. It's part of how our own cyber comply framework or tool set assess risks, for instance. It's a very widespread standard approach to dealing with risk assessment. So you should be aware ISO 27005-2022 is there. And if you're using it in a new management system and you aren't using the 2022 version, you're using the older version, you would expect your certification order to say to you, why are you using as guidance a standard which is no longer up to date? And so if you haven't specifically updated your risk assessment to refer to 27005-2022, expect some questions. You want to think about how you deal with that. But it should be part of your overall transition thinking because apart from anything else, you should be setting out how you approach information security risk assessment. That's a kind of normal part of implementing 27001. How does this impact you? Well, if you're in a certification body, then yes, it's going to impact you. The certification body has to work out what its transition arrangements are, considering the requirements of the IAF document and the transition arrangements of its accreditation body. Those transition arrangements have to address what the certification body shall do, that's the must, and what the client must do. The certification body may have separate documents to address transition arrangements, and the transition arrangement must at least include consideration of changes in ISO 27001 and a gap analysis which looks at what those changes might be for themselves as well as for their clients. And so when you look at requirements on the transition audit, which is the second box that you have there, the certification body may conduct the transition audits in conjunction with the surveillance audit, with the recertification audit, or through a separate audit. So it's a commercial discussion for clients to have with their CVs. You don't necessarily want to go through the disruption of having a separate certification audit, 27002 certification audit. It's as easy to do it at recertification time or at transition time. It's just a matter of you planning. You'll probably find your certification body prefers to tie it into an existing audit because they can use their own people much more effectively that way. But you can work to whatever makes practical commercial sense to you. The audit is not just a document review, and that's particularly for technological controls. So the transition audit has to include a gap analysis of the existing management system, the requirements of 27001-2022, and the changes to the client's ISMS. So that gap analysis, looking at clauses 4 through 10, is very minor. It's going to identify some changes to clauses that you need to make and the documents in which you need to make them. Very easy. The much more complex set of changes will be whatever you decide to do around risk assessment, and in particular, what controls you decide to adopt and what your strategy is around ISO 27002-2022. So you need a gap analysis. You need to set out clearly how you're going to update your statement of applicability, how you're going to update the risk treatment plan. Clearly, if you are changing your controls, your SOA and your RTP are by definition going to have to change. And you need to think about how you're going to manage how you're going to monitor the effectiveness of new or changed controls that you put in place. And the certification body is going to want to know how you are planning to do that. It's quite possible, it's allowed for the certification body to conduct the transition audit remotely if they're able to ensure the transition audit objective is met. So again, it's a matter of commercial discussion between client and certification body. It can be done remotely. It doesn't have to be in situ. It depends very much on auditing the transition, auditing the technological controls. So you've got to think about how that will work. So that's changes to the standard. So how does that implement organizations implementing ISO 27001? If you are implementing 27001 for the first time, you've got really two options. You could go, well, I know perfectly well that there are there's lots of skills in the marketplace to implement against the 2013 standard. I know the certification bodies are able to certify against that. I know that there is an existing framework, an existing ecosystem, so we're just going to get on with finishing an implementation or carrying out an implementation to ISO 27001 2013. And you could do that with a project which finishes anytime in the next year or two. Remember that 27001 2013 is not going to be retired until October 2025. So there's time for you to certify to the old standard and then to transition to the new standard if that's what you want to do. It depends on your commercial, practical and realities. The Annex A controls are not mandatory. It's a referent control set, so you only need to adopt the new controls if you have a risk for which they're appropriate. You could perfectly well go, well, I'm going to, in order to comply with 2022, change my Annex A to the 2022 control set. I know what the mapping is to 2013. I know which 2013 controls I've adopted and which ones I haven't, so I'll keep those justifications. I'm not going to adopt any of the new controls in ISO 27002 2022 on the grounds that I don't have that risk. That could be a very straightforward practical approach. So you could make, on paper, a transition to 2022 version of the standard relatively simply and relatively easily without having to do an awful lot of reworking of the organization, and then give yourself time later on to transition to the 2022 version of the standard. So you can have a SOA that reflects 2022, but is still looking at the controls that you've currently implemented, and you can transition later. So that's one way in which an organization can go about implementing 2022. The other practical way for most organizations, particularly starting now, given that we're just about the end of April and that in theory all certification bodies should already have made the transition, is you may as well just get on with building a management system that complies with the 2022 version of the standard. Certainly, by the time you're ready for an audit, every certification body has got to be over the line. If for most organizations, preparation will take 6 months. We often get small organizations there in between 3 and 6 months. But if you assume it's a 6-month period, by the time you're ready for certification, whatever happens, certification bodies are mandatorily required by the end of October 2023 to be ready for certification, to certify organizations to the 2022 version of the standard. So there may be commercial advantages in getting on with it quickly, being the first in your sector or the first in a region, winning a client. All of those might be good commercial reasons to get on with doing it quickly. The Annex A controls are really, because of the attributes, very easy to identify how they link to compliance obligations, a real value add in there. But remember, there's not necessarily a huge ecosystem yet of competent implementers, competent auditors, and on tools and documentation and so on that you can use. So being first has benefits. It also sometimes has disadvantages. So that's the kind of, if you're implementing ISO 27001 2022 for the first time. If you've already certified to the 2013 version of the standard, what do? Well, you've got a 3-year transition period. That's the first thing. There's no rush to do anything. 3 years. By the end of October 2025, assuming that you want to continue with your certification, and I assume you do because it's a sensible way to demonstrate to stakeholders that you take information security seriously, you've got 3 years to do it. So there's no rush. You can do it in your own time. And there might be some instances where you have to transition earlier because your certification body might stop offering research or audits to the 2013 version of the standard after the first 12-month period is up. So you just need to make sure that your certification body is happy with what you're proposing in terms of timetable. And you need to think about then doing the gap analysis. What's your strategy for transition going to look like? And how you could tie a 2022 certification audit into your existing recertification or external audit timeline. One of the advantages of implementing new controls is because they're identifiable by attribute, it's much easier to identify how they link to compliance obligations, compliance increasingly important for organizations, particularly with EU GDPR biting more and more, with SEC regulations coming in the US, with extensions to the NIS regulations. All of those, the ability to demonstrate compliance by selecting the right controls becomes more and more useful. So you've got time to put a strategy together. Remember that your gap analysis and the plan, clause 6, plan for changes to the ISMS, needs to update your risk assessment, update staff qualifications, update staff awareness, however you deliver staff awareness training, update internal communications, update your internal monitoring. You might have new controls to monitor, update your clause 9 and 10, review and evaluate what you're doing. So create a strategy. You've got time to do it. That's the key message. So what does a transition strategy look like? Well, the first thing you need is a strategy. You need a plan. You need to think about what the sensible way of doing this and where the business drivers are for the timing of when you make the transition, and you need to get management commitments to the transition. There needs to be a budget, there's work to do, there probably needs to be a project team. There's going to need to be coordination amongst a number of people to make the various changes, particularly in the control sets. So you need to have a team, a project team. So if you've implemented ISO 27001, this is just like a mini version of what you did implementing the management system. This is about planning and making changes to it. So that's the first step, management commitment. Second step is a gap analysis. Identify the documents, processes, and responsibilities that need updating, as well as the relevant external processes and the risk control compliance relationships that you haven't, that you haven't previously been documenting. So there's a gap analysis. You're going to identify all of the areas in which you need to work, and that's part of the first task of your project team, is to make sure that your gap analysis is complete. It's identified all of the areas that you need to be addressing. Allocate tasks, responsibilities, timelines, like any good project. It makes sense to be trying to improve your compliance posture wherever possible. The fact that controls now map to specific compliance attributes and other attributes makes sense for you to make sure that you've got them really clearly linked to your compliance objectives. Being able to say, when dealing with an ICO complaint or another regulatory complaint, our ISMS is specifically built to deal with those issues. We've given it forethought is a good place to be able to be. Worthwhile thinking about ISO 27701, that's the Personal Information Management System standard, 2717 and 27018, that's cyber security controls and personally identifiable information in the cloud. It's worthwhile thinking, as you're thinking about your transition, as to whether or not you include one or more of those standards in your transition plan. Each one of, all three of them, you can't get certification on their own. You can only get certification as part of the scope of an ISO 27001 management system. And 27701, if you're using 27001 as part of your GDPR compliance or your SEC compliance or your California Act compliance, whatever it is, 27701, its focus is personal information management. So it's very easy to build it into a 27001 management system. And it's worthwhile thinking about, as you put the business case together, do we want to broaden the scope? Are there business benefits to us in doing that? Are there regulatory benefits to us in doing that? And then putting it into your project plan. So when your certification body comes to do their transition audit, they're also giving you the value add of auditing, the addition of a new standard in the scope of your 27001 management system. Create a communication plan. Everybody needs to understand what you're doing, why you're doing it. You need to look at how you update skills, competences, and staff awareness. Remember the clause 7 requirement that people doing work inside the management system need to be appropriately qualified. That means lead implementers and lead auditors need to transition 2013 competence certificates to 2022 versions of competence certificates. You need to transition your staff awareness training, so it's specifically looking at 2022 and the control set that you've looked at. Your risk treatment plan, remember risk owners are supposed to sign off on residual risks. Risk owners should review their risks, the risks for which they're the owners, and the controls in the light of, assuming that you adopt the controls in 27002, not just using it as a reference control set, and identify improvements to the controls. and that planning should be part of your initial planning. And so logically, you can quickly see that risk owners, one way or another, need to be part of the project team that is thinking about how you're going to roll out your transition. Schedule the elements and get on with rolling it out. Deploy the amended process and procedures, as usual, well ahead of the certification body visit if you can, and try and complete one round of internal audits against the new standard and conduct a management review. Most certification auditors get really excited when they see the management system is genuinely really working, particularly if it's a new management system. If it's an existing management system, you made the transition, you might get by without a new management review. Certainly you will have had a management review which agrees that you need to make the transition. So planning, approving, carrying out, reviewing changes to the management system are all in line with the management standard. So that's how to put a transition strategy together. It's not rocket science. It's relatively straightforward. You're just simply changing a current management system where the core documentation, clauses 4 through 10, has only minor changes to it. The way in which your controls relates to your risk assessment and to your interests and requirements, your requirements of interested parties. Much more work perhaps around that, depending on your view of the controls and your view of the risks. But you simply got to put it together and you've got to roll it out, all of it driven by your gap analysis and then the changes that will come through to your statement of applicability and your risk treatment plan. So that's it, relatively straightforward. Lots of ways in which, as a company, we in IT governance can help organizations making the transition. And just some of the options here. Obviously, you can buy copies of the standards from our website. We're an IEC distributor, so you get the Pucker original ISO IEC standard. You've got our website, you can buy it and download it. We have a transition course, which is a one-day training course at the end of which you can take a transition exam, and that enables you to upgrade an existing 27001 2013 lead implementer or lead auditor certificate to the 2022 version. And not only can you update an IBITGQ qualification, you can bring a certificate for a lead implementer or lead auditor qualification that you did with some other body, and provided you put that up as evidence, you can transition that to now IBITGQ certification. Your single course and single exam can transition simultaneously lead implementer and lead auditor certificates, so it's a very practical, cost-effective way to do it. And of course, IBITGQ is ISO 17024 certificated itself, so it's an internationally recognized certification of personnel competence. You can also simply go and do a 2022 lead implementer or lead auditor training course. If you don't have a current certification, you can go and do a lead implementer, lead auditor training course, which will teach you how to do that to the 2022 version of the standard. We've then got a range of consultancy options. We've got a range of tools. We've got a cyber comply management system, a software platform that can help you implement a management system and transition it, which has got documentation, it's got a risk assessment tool. We've got consultancy support. We can fast track your implementation where we do a large amount of the work for you. We can do versions of that for small and large companies. We can put together transition packages where our consultancy team will help you make the transition and work with you to do that. So we've been doing this, as I said, for some 20 odd years. We've done transitions before, from BS 7799 to ISO 27001, and from 2005, 2008, 2013, and now. Yeah, so we kind of, our guys know how to do this. So lots of ways in which we can help you tackle that, and lots of ways you can get hold of us. So our UK, EU, and US businesses, all of those there, and we'll be sending out the slides to everybody who's signed on to this webinar in the course of the next day or two. So you'll be able to access all of the information which is in the slides, and of course all of our contact details through them. So that's it, ladies and gentlemen. That's the planned presentation, slightly longer than I planned, but nevertheless, now's the time for me to ask. Now's the time for me to answer any questions which you might have. So please do, in the chat panel or in the Q&A panel, type in your question. What I'll do is I'll take the questions in the order they come, and I'll share the question, and and provide the answer. So first question is, will organizations who have never had ISO 27001 do one plan to the updated one straight away? Yes, absolutely. You can just start off immediately, ignore 2013, simply get on with creating a plan to implement ISO 27001 2022. Start doing that today. By the time you're ready for certification, which as I said is typically 3 to 9 months, every certification body I expect will have made the transition. Is there any difference if we use ISO 31000 instead of ISO 27005 with respect to managing risks? No, not at all, except that, and it's worth bearing in mind, ISO 31000 and ISO 27005 are closely related. The core approach to risk assessment is exactly the same, but ISO 31000 is an enterprise risk level, enterprise risk management standard. It looks at the broad range of risks to an organization, of which information security is one. ISO 27005, if you like, is a subset of ISO 31000 because it deals very specifically with information security risk. So you can use ISO 31000, just be very clear in looking at it to identify the ways in which you adapt what it's providing guidance on how to do to the specific requirements of information security management as distinct from broader enterprise level risk management. If you're a certified auditor 2013, are you still qualified to audit until March 24? Yes, if you're a certified auditor 27001 2013, you're qualified to audit information security management systems to ISO 27001 2013, right up until the point at which they cease to be valid certificates. You're not qualified to audit management systems to the 2022 version, obviously, because you haven't transitioned your qualification, but you can audit because the two certification schemes exist in parallel. You can continue auditing 2013 management systems right up until the point at which 2013 is no longer a valid standard. You could do a transition exam, and then you could, because you'll be qualified to, audit 2013 management systems and audit 2022 management systems. You could do both of them because you've got both certifications. How will changes to ISO 27001 2013 impact a dependent standard like 27701? Will an organization already certified in 27001 plus 27001 2019? So there's a reasonable possibility 27701 will be brought into line quite quickly with 27001 2022, but you can recertify with 27001, 27701, 27018, 27017 in your scope. They don't need to have been updated to 2022, although it's highly likely that they will have been. So pay attention to the release timetable. The Joint Committee is working hard to try and bring all of the 27000 family standards into line with 27001 2022 as quickly as possible. But no, that's the reality of when you go for certification. 27019 is still a valid 27701 2019 is still a valid standard all the way up until the point that it too is withdrawn. And again, there'll be a transition period for that to happen. Can we start making changes to our documentation to suit the new standard while we're still certified in the old standard? Yes, absolutely you can. So what I would suggest you do is keep your management standard as 27001 2013. That's the standard to which the business is operating. That's the standard to which everybody is working. Work out what your transition plan looks like, what the timetable looks like. With the project team that you put together, talk about the areas that you need to change, so the gap analysis and the timetable, and then communicate to the business that over the period of, let's say you're going to go, you've got a recertification due in a year, and your target is to transition at the same point. Communicate to the business that you're going to be making a number of changes to the management system in that transitionary period. So it's just like, if you remember when you were implementing 27001 2013, you started implementing the clauses in the standard and the controls well ahead of your certification audit. There's no problem doing that. Exactly the same thing applies during this transition period. As long as everyone knows what's happening, you're documenting it, you're tracing the transition, and it's going into place. What your certification body will then see when they come to do the audit is not only have you made the transition, but it's effective, it's working inside your organization. What is the impact to organizations that have 27001 2013 with the 2019 privacy extension? I think I've dealt with that. So If you want me to come back to it, please re-ask it, but I think I've dealt with that. How to determine 27001(2) scope. We're a bank, just limit to IT and security. We're entire business enterprise. So nothing has changed in the requirements around scoping. There is a possibility of limiting the scope of 27001. Remember, 2022 is an advisory standard, it's not a requirement standard. There's an opportunity with 27001 to scope it around a particular part of the organization. But the requirements are that you have to be able to identify clearly who the management is, and that management team has to be able to make controls around how effective security operates. And you've got to be able to deal very clearly with the interfaces between what's in scope and what's outside of scope. So if you think about the security team inside a bank, actually, if you are getting 27001 security team, it would be looking at the security team's processes, not the bank's processes. And it might be, from a business perspective, the bank that's required to demonstrate compliance, not just the security team. And the scope of the management system on your certificate will say very clearly the information security team in the bank, if that's what you've done, is certificate ISO 27001. And anybody who wants confirmation that the bank is certificate is not going to get it, because your certificate will say it isn't. So you need to think very clearly about what the business objective is that you're trying to achieve, what the most effective method of doing that is. It's an area in which we do quite a lot of work with clients around the initial scoping of the management system to try and work through all of the issues. And it's quite complex, particularly in large and complex organizations, to get in place a scope that really works. Many of our larger clients in the end simply go, actually, let's just do the whole of the organization. It's more complex, it's harder, but the long-term benefits are so much greater, and it avoids us having to try and deal with the interface between parts of the organization and the rest of the organization, which can be extremely complicated. What new technical control will organizations find most challenging to implement? Well, that's a how long is a piece of string question, because it really depends on the nature of the organization. There are many organizations who are already in the tech space who will find implementing most of the technical controls relatively straightforward. They might be a bit more bothered by some of the physical or organizational controls. So I don't think there is a particular issue about which technical control will be more difficult to implement. The real thing is to think about what your risks are. What are the things that you're trying to deal with? Don't simply implement the controls because they're listed in Annex A. Remember, you don't have to implement all of them. You could have only 70 out of the 93 controls implemented, and that's perfectly acceptable. You still have a compliant management system. It's not mandatory to implement all of the controls. You implement only the controls for which there is a clause 4 requirement, a business regulatory or contractual requirement, or for which there is an identified risk. I passed the 27005 risk management exam in July 2021. What do I need to do to bring it up to date? Go on our transition training course. That will bring your transition up to date, because it will give you the understanding and knowledge of 27001 2022. You'll need to begin your certificate in to IBITGQ in order to do that, but that's how you transition it. For those of us that have used Cyber Comply to support our certification when we transition, yeah, absolutely, we'll map the controls for you. It's the easiest way to make the transition is to have Cyber Comply. It will simply go, you can go, right now I'm ready to make the transition. It will give you a mapping of the controls. It will link all of that to your risk assessment and to your clause 4 requirements. You're going to have to do a bit of work to make sure you've identified what you want, but it will manage that. It's the easiest, simplest way to manage a transition. It will update your statement of applicability, update the risk treatment plan. That's all in the use case and is proceeding very quickly to be available for you. Is the ISMS cyber assurance standard LV 12 a good way for organization to get to ISO 27001? ISMS will tell you that there is. The practical reality we find is that there is a big gap between organizations that go through self-certification activity, this is on Cyber Essentials as well, and what happens when there is an external audit of their compliance. The reality of ISO 27001 is it is written to be scaled to the size of the organization. So let's pretend you're an organization with just 2 employees or 2 or 3 employees. You don't need to implement the whole range of documentation that an organization of 23,000 employees might have to. We've done implementations where we designed documentation for an organization which was basically in an Excel folder. There was enough there for the 2 people inside the organization to be able to demonstrate compliance with ISO 27001. It's designed to scale to the organization. And our experience tends to be that if 27001 is where you want to be, it makes sense just to get on with and do it. If you try and comply with something else that's kind of a pathway to it, actually you get bogged down in doing that, and you lose a lot of time and effort, which you could simply put into taking you towards 27001 compliance. Can you certify against 27005? No. 27005 is a guidance standard on how to do risk assessments. As I said, it's not mandatory in a 27001 implementation. It is just guidance. It's very good, very focused guidance. Threat intelligence is at least in 2025 on our roadmap, and we're looking to certify in 2024. Will auditors be likely to accept a risk case for pushing this control out to that point? So auditors will accept basically whatever you tell them, as long as you are clear as to what it is that you're doing. If you are planning to implement threat intelligence, I imagine you're going to have identified a set of fairly obvious risks that would lead you to do that in the context of your organization. And you're going to identify, so it'll be on your risk treatment plan, we're going to implement threat intelligence as control. And there will be a specific set of steps that you have to go through to implement it, which are perhaps to do with technology or framework or competence and skills. All of those are part of the implementation plan for threat intelligence. So the auditor is got to accept that you've identified this as an appropriate control. It's in your statement of applicability, in your risk treatment plan. You've got a completely coherent set of steps that you're going to implement, that you're going to execute, to implement it over a period of time. I see no problem with that at all. If you simply say, we're going to implement this, but we're only doing it in 2025, I expect the auditors to have a real question about that, because you're misleading somebody looking at your statement of applicability. They'll go, you say you've got this, but actually the reality is you haven't, and you don't have a proper plan for implementing it, so it's not robust. As long as it's robust, it's clear, the auditor can understand it, there should be absolutely no problem at all. How would you consider the resources necessary to maintain the certification once transitioned? Well, it kind of depends on whether you want to do that manually or not. So all of our clients who have cyber comply will be transitioning. There will be audit modules, there'll be management review modules, all of those coming through as part of the 27001 user case, which will make maintenance really, really, really easy. For everybody else, it's as easy to maintain as a 27001 2013 management system is. It's still about what are the controls, how do you monitor the effectiveness of the controls. It's about doing internal audits. It's about collecting continual improvement information, collecting and monitoring changes in the requirements of interested parties, and on an annual basis at least, reviewing the risk assessment, reviewing all of those inputs to the management review and changing what you need to do and continuing on with that. The more complex maintenance stuff is about making sure that you're on top of risks on a week-to-week and month-to-month basis. We find that as an organization, we have 27001 and a number of other standards, including 27701. We can only stay on top of it because we have a team which deals with 27000, which deals with our management system. We are regularly updating processes on the basis of changed view of risk. So we're continually having to update and improve documentation. We're continually rolling that out to the organization. So for us, management review is a very straightforward thing. It's kind of just one of the things that comes along, but it's something you should just be doing. So you need to commit resource to management support, to ongoing maintenance and review of the management system. I think we're just about out of time. So one more question. Any advice for an education trust wanting to become certificated? The 27001 transition course covers 27005. Yes, is the answer to that question. Advice for an education trust wanting to become accredited is the same as my advice to any organization. Look at your business case, and I can see a business case for an education trust just as well as I can for anyone else. Talk to somebody like us. We can give you advice on scope, on complexity, help you put together an appropriate approach to implementation that's not going to be excessive, that's going to be appropriate for the organization size, and then just get on with it. Same as any any organization that does. And we've got you know, a number of education trusts, schools, academic bodies, and others that we work with in different ways. So it's not an environment that we're not familiar with, but that's the kind of basic advice that I will give you. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm afraid we are right out of time. It's spot on 5 o'clock. I hope that's been a useful webinar. As I said, the slides will go out so that you can access them in your own time. Please do, if we can help you, if any of our offerings can help, do take advantage of those, and do keep an eye on our website. There's a whole series of webinars coming out over the months ahead, some of them 27001 related, others more broadly cyber security and privacy related. And we're very happy to go on supporting our clients and the broader world in this increasingly complex and dangerous cyber insecure environment. Thank you all for your time. I hope you have a good evening. Bye-bye.